Okay, so now we are down at the bottom of the hill. We're basically the lowest spot in the landscape right now. So as we go through our 5 soil forming factors, again, the big one that's changed here is relief. Relief, just another term for where you are in the landscape, where you are in the slope. Here we're at the very bottom of the hill. Just behind us is the stream itself. So when that stream is running full, it probably does spill out over here. So we probably are at the edge of a little floodplain. Whereas before we were at the top of the hill, and that area is going to stay high and dry even during the biggest storms. So we'll see if that has an effect on the type of soil we see. It could have an effect on the parent material as well too, which is another of the 5 soil forming factors, because the soil here may be formed from material that's being brought in and deposited during floods by the stream. So let's take a quick peek. All right, so we're down at about the same depth as the hole on the top. I've laid it out in another piece of gutter. Now we're going to lay the 2 gutters side by side, compare the soils, and see how the soil at the top of the hill differs from the soil at the bottom of the hill. All right, so now we're looking at our 2 soil cores side by side. And hopefully when you see them right next to each other, you'll see that there are some real differences between them. Up at the top, they look pretty similar. We've got our A horizon from our soil by the stream side, and our A horizon by the soil up at the top of the hill. There's differences there though. I mean, the one from the bottom of the hill is certainly a lot darker. There's also a lot more moisture in there. I can just feel that, which is not surprising. Where does water run? It always runs downhill. So usually the soil that's at a lower elevation is going to be wetter. Where we really start seeing the differences though is as we get into our B horizon on our uphill soil. There we have this nice red, fairly clay-rich B horizon. Down below, we have something that's much more gray. And these gray colors, they're kind of mixed in with some bright reds and oranges, but these gray colors are telling us something. These gray colors are indicators of wetness. This is telling us where the groundwater in this soil reaches at its highest point. When a soil has a lot of oxygen in it, not a lot of water, the iron in that soil becomes iron oxide, which is basically that rusty red color. When you leave your bike outside and it rusts, that's iron oxide. However, when a soil is really wet for at least 2 weeks or more out of the year, meaning totally saturated, every pore space of that soil is filled with water, that iron dissolves and washes away, and what's left behind are these gray splotches mixed with some of those red and orange and yellow colors. So we start seeing those gray splotches. It tells us that, let's say if we were to come to this same soil in early April when water tables are usually the highest, if we were to dig down to this depth, the hole would probably start filling up with water. The changes get even more extreme as we go down deeper. Speaking of gray splotches, now the soil by the stream is mostly gray. The soil up at the top of the hill still has that nice orange-red color. So this is showing us that this soil here is dry. The top of the hill soil is dry. This soil is very, very wet, and wet for probably several months out of the year. And that's the reason that you see those gray colors predominate. If we split open this soil, you will see that there are still splotches of bright orange or red. Those are areas that for whatever reason have a little bit of oxygen still in them, so the iron stays as that iron oxide. Maybe that's a worm channel, maybe that's a root channel, or some other pore space that's allowing oxygen to get down into this otherwise very wet soil and causing the soil to stay fairly orange. It's hard to say. As we go down deeper, this floodplain soil, the bottom of the hill soil, kind of transitions to an even lighter color gray. And this one, I'm not really seeing any of those orange splotches whatsoever through this soil. So this is telling us that this soil is basically wet for a majority of the year, probably more than 6 months out of the year this soil is saturated. I'm actually a little surprised that we're not seeing any water in the soil right now. You know, we've had a pretty hot summer, so the soil might have dried out over the summer and the water table is still beginning to rebound very, very, very slowly. But that gray color shows us that's a really, really, really wet soil. versus what's at the top of the hill, we're still seeing those orange colors. This is a really dry soil. And you kind of tell the difference just in the way that they look in my hand, other than the color. The dry soil is really powdery. The wet soil is not. It doesn't powder apart like that. It's got a lot of moisture in it, so it stays stuck together pretty well. Another thing we found in the very bottom of this bottom of the hill soil, the floodplain soil, are lots of rocks. This is a rock. This is a hard rock. That's not saprolite. I have a feeling, given the number of rocks we're finding down in the bottom of this soil, where we're digging right now probably used to be the bottom of the creek at some point. So we're looking at probably old creek bed gravels. And over time, the stream has changed its course a little bit, and now this area is dry, part of the floodplain. But if you dig down deep enough, you see where that creek used to flow. So you look at these two soils, the parent materials may be a little bit different, but really what we're looking at is changes in relief. Climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. Those are the 5 soil forming factors. This shows you what a big difference in soil a change in relief can make. We probably only traveled about 75 feet between these two soils, but they look totally different from each other because of that change in landscape position or relief. All right, so here we have 2 little pieces of saprolite. These are the pieces of not quite rock, not quite soil material, stuff that's sort of in transition between those 2 states. So they're solid, but if you squeeze them enough between your thumb and forefinger, they will pop. They'll just disintegrate. So that's saprolite. Basically, it's rock that's halfway on its journey towards becoming soil. All right, so before we go, we're going to do a quick example of what we call texturing. Texture is this percentage of sand, silt, and clay in a soil. And you can generally tell the texture based upon what we call the ribbon test. If it's a clayey soil, it'll stick together. If it's a sandy soil, it'll just disintegrate and fall apart. If it's a silty soil, it's somewhere in between. Silt feels kind of like a wet talcum powder or a wet baby powder, if you will. So generally, what we'll try and do is get a sample of soil, and I picked this one because it's already pretty wet, but we want to wet it down just a little bit, so I'm going to give it a couple sprays with my spray bottle until it's the texture of Play-Doh. It should feel kind of like Play-Doh, so it's not going to be too wet, but it's certainly not going to be dry either. It should just have a nice, smooth, Play-Doh-like consistency. And then when we say ribbon, what we mean by ribbon is how long can you squeeze that soil out between your thumb and forefinger and have it hold its shape before it breaks. There, it just broke like that. So that is our ribbon. The longer the ribbon you can make from your soil before it breaks off, the more clay you have in it. The more sand and to a lesser extent silt you have in your soil, the shorter that ribbon is going to be. Generally speaking, if you can only make a ribbon that's less than 1 inch in length, and this is real close to 1 inch, this is probably just slightly over 1 inch, then you're probably dealing with something like a sandy loam or a silt loam. If you can make a ribbon that's between 1 and 2 inches in length, you're probably dealing with something like a sandy clay loam, a silty clay loam, or a clay loam. And if you can make a ribbon that's 2 inches or even much, much longer, you're probably dealing with some sort of clay. Silty clay, sandy clay, or just straight clay. So as I'm squeezing this one out, the ribbons aren't very long, so I think we're dealing with some sort of silt loam or loam. So the next check that we do in our field texturing after we make our ribbon is we get a little pea-sized chunk of that soil, put it in the palm of your hand, and this time you really do want to soak it. You want to saturate it. And you take your thumb or your finger and you just grind that soil into the palm of your hand. And this really helps you feel the sand in there, because if there's a good bit of sand in that sample, it's going to feel real gritty. Sometimes you can even see the bigger particles of sand. If it's silt, it's going to feel real smooth. If it's clay, it's going to feel real smooth and real sticky. What this feels like to me is kind of a combo of silt with a little bit of sand mixed in. So I would say this soil is probably right on the border of a silt loam and a regular loam. What is a loam? A loam is a mix of sand, silt, and clay. So this is probably either close to an even mix of sand, silt, and clay, or maybe just a little bit heavy on the silt because it felt pretty smooth and powdery.